Okay, well, it is about time for us to get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. If you want to open to page 41 in your workbooks, that's where we're going to be tonight. And then if you want to open to Numbers 31 in your Bibles, that's where we're going to be started in Scripture tonight. Numbers 31 in your Bibles and page 41 in your workbooks. We're going to be in lesson number 12, talking about preparing for conquest. But before we get started, let's go ahead and say our memory verse together. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." That's obviously taken from Numbers 13:30. And what we're going to be talking about, if you notice the title of lesson 12 is Preparing for Conquest. And then next week, we're going to kind of be talking about the end of this whole era. If you remember in one of the beginning classes, you could kind of look at this class as a class on the Exodus, but obviously we're well past the event of the Exodus at this point. You could look at this class as a Life of Moses class. We started in the introduction talking about his birth. We started in the first class talking about his call to be the leader of God's people. And then, spoiler alert, next week, Moses is going to die. And so that's where we're going to end this class. This is where we're at. We're almost to Canaan. We're almost out of the wilderness. But I wanted to go back to something we talked about last week, Numbers 31. We had some trouble with Midian, and there's certain things you can kind of go at a pretty good pace through in a Bible class. There's some things that you don't want to just brush over and speed through. Obviously, you want to always treat the Word of God delicately and with the reverence it deserves, but especially this chapter. This is a tough chapter. Ben has talked about this in his class. We touched on it last week. But just to kind of point out some things in this, to kind of conclude this trouble with Midian and what happens in Numbers 31, one thing I want to point out with this destruction of Midian, in a sense wiping out Midian, is that far-reaching sin has far-reaching consequences. And I have up there, remember David. If you think about the life of David, we know that God is faithful and just to forgive us, right? We know that God is a merciful God, God is a gracious God, but sin does have consequences on people. Now, a big difference here is Midian is not by any means a righteous nation. The Midianites are obviously a very deceitful people. We read last week about them. They're trying to curse the Israelites. That doesn't work out. We read the story of Balaam and Balak. But then in what happens with Midian, we see kind of what it looks like. We, in a sense, see a case study of God's judgment on a nation, on a national level. And so we know that sin has far-reaching consequences. They're going up against God's people. We've talked about this. We talked about this with Pharaoh, what it's like to go toe-to-toe, in a sense, with the God of the universe. That is not a battle you want to pick. You do not want to mess with God's people. You do not want to tempt God's people. You do not want to try and curse God's people. And so you see this idea of God's judgment on Midian as a nation. There's a couple passages we could go to. One of them is in Deuteronomy chapter 9. In Deuteronomy 9 and verse 4, "Do not say in your heart, after the Lord has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess the land, whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you." We see this idea throughout Scripture of God, and we're going to actually kind of come back to this concept at the end of tonight's class. You see this over and over again, that God will use nations to wipe out other nations. And we're going to see, we're going to reference in just a moment the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 6, you actually see God raise up the Midianites from seemingly nothing to use the Midianites against his people. So if the Midianites are being unrighteous, he will use the Midianites. He will wipe out the Midianites with his people. But if his people are being unrighteous, he can raise up the Midianites to use against the Israelites, and he will do that in his justice and in his righteousness. We also talked about this concept of this vengeance is for God himself. We talked last week, and we've talked in past classes about our sinful jealousy, our spiteful jealousy, our pettiness, if you will, versus God's perfect jealousy. God has every right to be jealous. Other gods do not exist, so if they start, in some versions it says, prostituting themselves after other gods, obviously that's something that the one true God of the universe is not going to take lightly. So this vengeance is vengeance for God himself. And then you also see this idea in Numbers chapter 31. These spoils are dedicated to the Lord after being purified, at least a portion of them are. But you also see this idea of purification. So even after this judgment is carried out, the people who carried out the judgment, people who have shed blood, they go through this purification process. The spoils themselves are both washed with water and purged with fire. And so again, we've talked about this concept of holiness and sanctification and purification and all of those things, and you kind of see those things play out here. Now, like I said, this is a difficult passage for several reasons, but a lot of people will kind of take this passage out of context and just kind of read some certain verses and draw certain conclusions about the Bible. But you see here again, besides what we just saw on the last slide, you see this idea that we talked about last week about, when you read out of context, the people are taking the women as captives, and then they're told, kill the women, right? Kill the prisoners. Don't take no prisoner, basically. If you look back at what the problem was, how all of this started, the women were basically the tool that the Midianites were using to start all of this. And so they were kind of the main issue, right? As far as being the means by which the Israelites brought this judgment on themselves. And then you also see several other things that maybe stick out to you in Numbers 31. I want to read in Numbers 25, verses 1 and 2. Going back to, you kind of have to go back and forth between Numbers 25 and Numbers 31 because, you kind of see the cause and the effect. But in Numbers 25, verse 1, while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal Peor. So again, we talked about the cause of all of this, but then in Numbers 31 and verse 16, verse 15, Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor, and so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him." And so, again, we go through these instructions that God gives the people. But again, you see this judgment on a nation, on a national level. And one thing I wanted to point out, right after where I was just reading, verse 18, but all the young girls who have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. That especially, obviously, is a verse that I'm sure we can all understand how that could be taken out of context and misunderstood. But I want to read a couple passages because we've talked in past classes about how God has very strict rules for the nation of Israel about how they are to treat foreigners. And if you remember, as we go throughout the wilderness story, you see this language over and over again of do not oppress foreigners because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Do not oppress your slaves. Do not abuse your slaves because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. So remember, God is always telling the people of Israel, you know what it's like to be prisoners of war, so to speak. You know what it's like to be captives. You know what it's like to be slaves. And so you are not going to treat other people the way you were treated back in Israel. So if you look at Leviticus 19, verses 33 and 34, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Another one is Deuteronomy 21. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, in verse 10, Deuteronomy 21, verse 10, we see some more specific laws about marrying female captives. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother. A full month after you may go into her and be with her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So all that to say, there are very specific laws about different scenarios. So God would have given them very specific laws and instructions about these different scenarios and these different captives that they would have taken. But again, he always keeps going back to how they were treated in the past, how they were treated when they were conquered. And so you see him giving very specific and detailed instructions about how they are to be treated. And then, but again, in Judges 6, like we mentioned a moment ago, you could kind of read in Numbers 31 and think, okay, you would think the Midianites were gone after all of this, but evidently they're not. Historical records show us that there likely were many other Midianites had intermarried with other nations. We talked about last week that the Midianites and the Moabites kind of ganged up together against the Israelites, so we see them working with other nations in that sense. So there would have presumably been, we know there were more Midianites because they show up again in Judges 6. But again, through all of this, you see God is in control of the nations. He righteously judges the nations. And so if a nation is unrighteous, he can use another nation to wipe them out. And if his own people are being unrighteous, he can raise up a nation against them to punish even his own people. And so we get to God using the Midianite, even raising up the Midianites later in the book of Judges against his own people. So this is by no means a perfect explanation or an exhaustive explanation, but I did just want to address Numbers 31, and like I said, I didn't want to just gloss over it last week. So any comments? I mean, there's a lot we could say, but I don't know if anyone, Joanna?
We're just pointing out that there's a difference between the earthly consequences of sin and the spiritual consequences of sin. We know the spiritual consequences are to the individual. Ezekiel's very clear about that. But the earthly consequences of sin spill on to innocent people quite frequently and on to others. And it's unfortunate, but that's how it goes. Exactly.
Again, going back to David. David got his life right before God. David was a man after God's own heart, but again, even a generally righteous man had innocent life his sin cost innocent life, right? And so we see that in the world around us, we see that in the Bible, we see that here. So that's a great point, that there's a difference between being guilty spiritually and bringing consequences of your own actions upon yourself, but also those consequences those can be very far-reaching consequences for other people as well. Yes?
Ezekiel 18 spreads, I think, light on that subject as well. When the children of Israel are in captivity, in the Babylonian captivity, and they raise that proverb. And Ezekiel says, you speak this proverb, and why are the children having to be punished, essentially, for the sins of their fathers? Well, it's a very explicit description or explanation of that. So when you filter that with all of the other things that you're saying, I think you can see it the way, like our sister's saying right here, the difference between the physical judgment and the spiritual judgment, and how does God see it? And we all have enough sin, each one of us individually, to all end up in hell on the basis of what we have done. And we may be suffering the consequences of what our fathers, grandfathers, or even great-grandfathers have done. And yet, before God, we are held as we do. And I think that enlightens some of this too.
Exactly. That's a great point as well. I was thinking last weekend in our past couple classes about Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb they survived the wilderness, but they had to wander in the wilderness. God didn't just say, okay, you two are good, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward to you all being in the promised land. They had to wait and essentially literally wait for their entire generation to die, watch all their colleagues, for lack of a better term, all their brothers die, but they still were spared to enter the promised land. So again, you see all these very complex and nuanced ways in which God enacts his justice on a national scale, but even on an individual scale. I do want to move on to some of the other topics we are going to go into. We're going to kind of look at this area to the northeast. If you notice, if you think about where we've been, we got out of Egypt, of course, and then we've kind of been in the Sinai Peninsula for a long time. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, I showed a map where they basically spent about pretty much the majority of the 40 years right about here. And so in these last couple weeks, the last two classes that we have, including tonight, we're really going to be up here. We're going to be mainly in Moab, just north of Edom, and then Mount Nebo. Again, spoiler alert, Mount Nebo is where Moses is going to die. So that's what we're going to be talking about the next couple weeks. But if we look kind of closer at this, in your reading, you'll notice that we're talking about the land east of the Jordan and then crossing over the Jordan. So you kind of see that the nation of Israel is coming up kind of this way. For part of it, they're in the wilderness of Zin. We've read about Kadesh Barnea. We've heard some of these names. And then, so this is the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, and then they're going to come up, and then up here, above where this map ends, is where they're going to cross over the Jordan into this section of land that is the Promised Land. So we see this Promised Land here. Sorry that's small, but that says the Promised Land according to Numbers 34 and Ezekiel 47. And then as it's referenced in some of our readings and in some of our future readings, this is the land that ends up being allotted by Moses and Joshua, and then presumably going from Kadesh Barnea and just kind of going all up through the Promised Land, and then eventually coming back. That's the route taken of the Israelite spies. And then as we get to talking about Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, notice how they're on this side, the east side of the Jordan River, this black line here between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is the Jordan River. So eventually and you can see how it breaks up right here, where Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh are on the east side. They don't want to cross over, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but then everyone else crosses the Jordan River and settle over here. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about Numbers 32, which is where we read about Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. What happens with these 2.5 tribes? How does this come up? Why do they end up on the east side of the Jordan River? Stephen?
Well, when they saw the land, they thought it was good for livestock, and that's what they were doing, is raising livestock. So really they petitioned Moses and said, hey, we'd like to stay here. You guys go ahead. Moses then says, well, you're going to leave all your brothers to fight without you? And they said, well, we will go and fight for our brothers until they receive all their inheritance, and then we'll come back. But he allowed them to build cities and build an infrastructure to get started.
Exactly. So that's pretty much it. So they have livestock. They want a place to keep their livestock. They see the land is good. But I appreciate you mentioning that conversation that the tribal fathers, the patriarchs, for lack of a better term, end up having with Moses, where Moses kind of gets frustrated with them, and I think understandably so. In Numbers 32, in verse 6, but Moses said to the people of Gad and to the people of Reuben, shall your brothers go to war while you sit here? Why will you discourage the heart of the people of Israel from going into that land that the Lord has given them? Your fathers did this when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. And so it's interesting because Moses kind of goes on this, I don't want to call it a rant or a tangent because he has a very good point, but he kind of goes on this tangent about why don't you want to enter the land? Why? God is trying to give you a present, and God is giving you a gift. God is fulfilling his promise, but these people just insist on, well, we don't want to fight the Canaanites. They seem too big for us. They seem too powerful for us. And that's why they had spent these 40 years in the wilderness. But now, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, and part of Manasseh are going to end up, in a sense, asking not to enter the promised land because they're just kind of fine where they are. That could be a great lesson for us about going out of our comfort zone, right? What if God has something better for you right beyond where you think you're comfortable or what you think you're capable of, right? But like Stephen said, they do end up kind of reaching this agreement with Moses that they're not going to leave their brothers to fight by themselves. They are going to fight alongside their kinsmen. So they are going to end up inhabiting the land together. So they have already, in a sense, conquered good land. If you notice, they have already conquered Sihon and Og, and so that's where they're going to end up staying. But they do agree that they will go forward with the conquest and then go back to that land and settle there. And then Moses and the tribal chiefs reach an agreement. Another passage I wanted to talk about was Numbers 35. Talking about the cities of refuge. What are cities of refuge? Tim?
There were 3 on the east and 3 on the west, and they happen to coincide and lie within the 48 cities that were allocated to the Levites. That's where, if a manslayer or someone who's accused of murder could go and seek refuge until they could be adjudicated, until they could be tried. If they were found guilty, then there's a whole process.
Right. Yeah, there's kind of a whole process here. So what's interesting about the cities of refuge is like Tim mentioned, there were 3 on the east side and 3 on the west side of the Jordan River. But they're exactly that. They're set up because they, just what Tim was saying about if someone is accused of murder, there's kind of this distinction, almost like we have in our law. There's first-degree murder, second-degree murder. There's manslaughter, which is usually accidental. I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me on that. But we do have different laws about different types of murder. If you take a life and it's not intentional, then there is obviously going to be a different sentence for that than kind of what it says here. If you'll read with me in Numbers 35 and verse 16, but if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. And if he struck him down with a stone, it mentions all these different things: a stone tool, a wooden tool, or an iron object. Verse 19, the avenger of blood shall himself put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred or hurled something at him, lying in wait so that he died, or in enmity struck him down with his hand so that he died, when he struck then he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. But if he pushed him suddenly without enmity, or hurled anything on him without lying in wait, or used a stone that could cause death, and without seeing him dropped it on him so that he died, though he was not his enemy and did not seek his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules. So, we won't go all into the entire process of adjudicating all of this, but it is interesting that we just kind of see more of their legal system, right? And just more of what their life was like. But you also do see, one thing I wanted to mention about these cities of refuge is we've kind of talked about this idea of God's grace before, where God gives his people an out. And what I mean by that is, if you'll think back to the 7th plague, the hail plague, that was something we see there is that God tells even the Egyptians, if you fear me, if you believe what I say, and you go inside and you take all your slaves inside and you take your children and your livestock, and if everything's, under protection from the elements, essentially, if you believe that I'm about to send this plague, I will spare you. I allow you to do something to save yourself from this. And so it's interesting to me that God sets up these cities. So if you think about it, if you accidentally killed someone, you would still have to follow these rules. There's still a process for these things. But God, in his mercy and in his wisdom, he allows this way for these things to be adjudicated. He sets up this process for all of these things so that this manslaughter, these accidental deaths, there's still justice served in a sense, right? It's kind of a punishment in a sense to have to move to this city of refuge, but you are eventually allowed to come back. And then even the idea of an avenger of blood, right? We think you'll hear stories, in the news and things like that, of people avenging their loved one's death in certain ways. So that was kind of the system that was set in place. But even then, it wasn't just a few weeks ago when we talked about more about their laws and their justice system, we talked about this isn't just, no holds barred kind of vigilante justice, right? There's rules for these things, and even who the avenger would have been, and again, this process for all of this being adjudicated. This isn't just you killed my relative or you accidentally killed my brother or something like that, so I'm just going to wipe out your whole family or something like that. There's a process for all of these things, and there's a system that God sets in place. But something else that we see is this idea of polluting the land. And so where do you see this language of, if you'll look at Numbers 35, and verse 33, you shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. So, how do we see, why is this idea of polluting the land relevant to bringing them in the first place? How does this kind of relate to this overall idea of holiness and purity that we've talked about before?
Back to Genesis, Cain killed Abel, and God sent blood crying out from the ground. So, symbolically, if nothing else, God sees it that way. He's seen it that way from the very beginning. And I think He's telling us how the sanctity of life, that a life is not just be wiped out without thought.
Exactly. Life is precious. Human beings are made in the image of God, right? We all are, even the bad ones, right? Everybody is made in the image of God. And so I love that reference of thinking about Abel's blood crying out, God saying to Cain, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. But that idea of, we talk about pollution in a very different sense. We talk about very different types of pollution, but this is what God views as pollution, right? As far as the land of Canaan is concerned, we are purging this land. You are to clean this land out for yourselves. And so we're actually going to see more of that idea in Numbers 33. So if you'll actually go back a couple chapters to Numbers 33, we're going to see more about this idea of purging the land, not having the land be polluted. And in Numbers 33, if you'll read with me in verse 50, and the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land, and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell, and I will do to you as I thought to do to them. Then.
It's just that language, polluted, is interesting. Psalm 106, verse 37 and 38 They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with the blood. And that same language is also found in Jeremiah 3, verse 1. God says, if a husband divorces his wife, and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? So it's interesting just that language that's seen throughout the Old Testament with respect to sin.
Exactly. We see this idea of purity over and over again, even going back to Cain and Abel, like was mentioned, and even Adam and Eve, when they realized that they had sinned, they realized that they were naked and they were ashamed. And you see this idea of, God creates things good, and God creates things to be good and beautiful and holy and sanctified, and God works to make those things, to make things pure. He wants us to be pure. He wants us to maintain our holiness and to not be polluted. But unfortunately, humans are really good at polluting things. And there's all these different examples of the horrific things that Ben was just reading in Psalm 106 of, child sacrifice. I don't know that there's a more heinous crime that a civilization could be taking part in. And so just seeing those instructions for how these people are to be treated, and what this is supposed to look like. And so we see this idea of cleaning over and over again. They're cleaning out the land in multiple ways. I love that language of, it's interesting that he talks about that the Lord is very specific about destroying the figured stones, destroy their metal images, demolish their high places. So not only are they getting the evil people out of the land and the evil influence out of the land, but they're supposed to, which I don't want to steal Zach's thunder for next quarter, but it's not going to go very well. But they're in theory going to destroy all of these idols and get rid of all these influences and get rid of all these people also. And so they're cleaning out the land in multiple ways. And we see that God takes that idea of purging very seriously. You see a couple of metaphors there, barbs, thorns, and then I added, if you think about like mold, these are two very different things, obviously, but mold and cancer are just two very specific scenarios where if you've ever had mold, if you've ever had a mold problem, it is very difficult to get mold out of somewhere where it is, and it just festers and it grows and everything gets gross and infected and you have to clean everything out. And then cancer as well, it's very serious, it spreads very fast, and that's why treatment is so devastating and so invasive, is just getting all of it out of there. But that's not something that you want to take lightly, right? And so you just think about these things that are so horrific and so it's not to be taken lightly, right? And so this idea of purging and getting all of the bad out of there and getting all the bad influences out of there and destroying the high places and destroying the idols and getting the people out of there, and even going back to Numbers 31 with, the people are trying to save the women, but he's like, well, no, like they were what caused all of this. And so just making sure, again, I mentioned this last week, but when you think about Jesus talking on the Sermon on the Mount and saying, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. God takes sin very, very seriously. And on behalf of himself and on behalf of his people, he takes extreme measures, and he expects extreme measures to be taken to get the sin out, to purge the sin, clean out the sin, clean out the promised land, be sanctified, be holy, for I am holy. And it all goes back to God and his character and how he is as God, but also how he expects his people to be because they are his. I know I've just kind of talked a lot about that whole idea, but what comments do you have about this purging and cleansing that's supposed to happen as they go into the land? Stephen?
Part of the very last verse of chapter 35, part of the reason they were to not pollute the land is God was going to dwell among them. That was a place for him to dwell among his people. And he needed that to be pure for him to dwell there.
That's a great point as well. God is going to dwell amongst his people, and God cannot be where unholiness is. He will not be where unholiness is. And so if the land is not pure, God cannot and will not be there. And so in a sense, it's very matter of fact, but it's also a warning, right? Is if you do not do this my way, and but again, it's not just for himself. It is for himself, but it's also for their sake, because you see, again, that image of having a barb in your eye. I've had some pretty bad splinters. I've never had a splinter in my eye, and that, I think, would just be maybe some of the worst pain you could experience, I would imagine. But that's how bad it would be for them. And again, not to steal Zach's thunder for next quarter, but it's going to be that bad for them. And so it's coming from a place of love, and it's a warning of, if you do this, this will hurt you, and it will not turn out well for you. And he's just honest with them, right? What other comments do you have? Ryan?
Just a reminder of 1 Corinthians 5, where bringing it to the New Testament, everything is the same. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Y'all should be ashamed of what you're doing, but instead you're puffed up, you're glorifying yourselves, and you're proud of your sin. And the same concepts are there. It's like the church must be holy. Like, we cannot tolerate sin. It can't be allowed to remain, and us be glorifying that. I don't know. I just think it's interesting that these themes are continuous.
Exactly. We've talked in past classes about this false idea that people have about the God of the Old Testament is serious and severe, and then the God of the New Testament is loving and gentle. But you see all of those sides you see God in his fullness and holiness and righteousness consistently throughout Scripture. What he expects of his church, what he expects of his people now, as far as like the rules and the mandates obviously are different, but as far as the type of people he is looking for and the type of people he will associate with, right? God's not willing that any should perish, but he does expect cleanliness from his people, right? The whole point of him washing us is so that we would be clean, right? Should we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. Why would you do that? The whole point of Jesus dying on the cross was so that we could be clean. Why would we go and be dirty again? Why would we do these old things that we used to do? And so, unfortunately, that's what you see here. That's the warning that he's giving them as they're about to enter the promised land is, you have to be this way. Everything that you've gone through, I have proved myself. God had proven himself over and over and over again. And he had made it very clear with Nadab and Abihu, and with Moses, and with Aaron, and with Miriam, and with Korah, and with all these different people in all these different circumstances. God demands respect, and God demands holiness and purity and cleanliness. And as it says on the board, if it's not cleaned out effectively, it will only get worse. You do not let an infection or mold or cancer, or if you had a barb in your eye, you're not going to let it sit there, because that needs to be addressed deeply and immediately, right? What else? Anything else? Matt.
I see this as God being a father. Like, we tell our kids, hey, get rid of all the stuff that's going to harm you, right? If it's going to be a bad influence on you, get rid of it, And he's telling his children, hey, purge it, get rid of it. And to me, I see this as a very parental act, saying, get rid of all that stuff. Because we do the same thing with our boys, Hey, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, that's going to lead to bad things for you, If you don't study for that test, that's going to cause you to fail, right? Things like that, right? Hey, actually wash that dish or you're going to have a science experiment going, right? Things like that. I see the same thing here. Purge the land. Get rid of all those things that are going to cause you problems down the road. So to me, this is just him being a father to his people.
Exactly. And you see that with interpersonal relationships as well, right? Being in the world, not of the world, where, if this person you're dating or your best friend is not having a good influence on you, then that's something we really need to address now, right? Because it's not going to turn out well for you, right? And in that same paternal sense of, I don't like who you've become since you started hanging out with those guys, or I don't like who you've become since you started dating that girl, or whatever, right? In the same sense, this is changing you and not for the better, right? And so that's what you see playing out on a national scale, but again, God, in his fatherhood and out of his love for them, he doesn't want them to hurt themselves. But again, it goes back to his holiness, like Stephen pointed out a minute ago, where his people cannot be like that. So if they're going to choose to be like that, they will not be his people anymore. And that will be that. I want to conclude in the last few minutes with Deuteronomy chapter 4. We're going to talk more about Moses' final reflections next week, but in Deuteronomy chapter 4, we get a little view of Moses looking back on how things had gone, how the Exodus had gone, how the time in the wilderness had gone. And if you'll read with me in Deuteronomy chapter 4, "For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, and that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you the nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land, to give to you their land for an inheritance as it is this day. Know therefore today and lay it on your heart that the Lord is God in heaven and above earth and on the earth beneath. In heaven above and on the earth beneath, there is no other. Therefore you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time." So, it's incredible to read that verse because, we think about what it would have been like to be there, right? We can put ourselves in the shoes of the Egyptians and of the Israelites and seeing these things, but I almost think about this as God telling the story of the Exodus from his perspective. This is what he was doing. This is his take, if you will, of what all of this has been, these trials and these tribulations and this war and all the things that we've seen and all the things that we've been talking about. This is God trying to bless his people. It's him loving them through the wilderness, loving them through these wars and through this discipline, right? And so he's just relaying this to Moses, and Moses is relaying this to the people of, this is what I've been trying to do, not just for myself and for my own name, but notice what it says at the very end there, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time. One last passage I want to read is a couple chapters over in Deuteronomy chapter 6, maybe one of the most famous passages in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6 and verses 4 through 9. All of this goes back to God's character, who God is as God, the type of people he wants for himself, the type of people he expects his people to be. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And then he goes on to talk about when you're brought into the land, this is what, you always have to be reminded of these things. You can't get tired of hearing the Word of God. You can't know too much about the Word of God. And so the thought I would leave you with is laying it on our hearts, keeping it in our minds, reflecting it in our hearts. Different versions say different things, but keeping the statutes of God, keeping the law of the Lord in the forefront of our minds, right? The point has always been who God is, and sin is a failure to recognize his power in a sense, right? The Lord our God, the Lord is one. We see him and his mercy and his grace, and so if we see him for who he is, we're going to want to serve him and be like him and be holy as he is holy. And if we fail to recognize that, then it's not going to work out well for us. Okay, we'll be back next week for our last class. Thank you.